Hello there, and welcome back to Amiable Arguments, or to it if you've just joined us for the first time, in which case, welcome. I'm Luca, and I'm joined today by Joe. So, hi Joe.
Hello, hello, Luca. Good to talk to you again.
Yes, good to talk to you again too. Seeing as Joe, like every other guest I've had on here, knows me personally, and we all went to drama school together. So if you
We
want,
did
if
indeed. We did.
yes, so if you want to help me stop this being some big drama school groupie session, which is basically just a podcast with me catching up with my mates, then get in touch with me so I can talk to some new people. Anyway,
Yeah, definitely.
anyway,
He
but
he he knows a lot of people. He gets around, does Luca?
I do, although not in lockdown. Um,
No.
I think this is actually going to be a really quite fun and easy subject that Joe's chosen for us today. So Joe and I are going to be talking about comedy.
Yes, we are. We are.
Oh yeah, that's
For yeah, for those of you who maybe don't know anything about me, which I'm sure there's some people. I have in fact been a comedian for I'd say about 6 years now. It's got to be 6 years on and off. Obviously, not during the lockdown. There's no comedy going on. Um, on stage or live. I mean, I have been doing some videos, some little like sketch videos on YouTube and things like that. But that's sort of the extent of everything at the moment. I think everything's moved online.
yeah. No, he is. Joe is an aspiring comedian, and he's quite good. I even laughed at him once. So he's
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, they say you can't please everyone, don't they? Say you can't please everyone. Well, you know what they used to have the. Do you remember the careers advisors at school? Do you remember those?
yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, when I went into the careers advisor, I went in and he said, "Joe, what do you want to do for a living?" I said, I want to be a comedian." And when I said I wanted to be a comedian, he laughed at me. He's not laughing now, is he?
Oh, it would be funny if it weren't for the fact the Joker had used that joke like 2 years earlier.
I think the first person to use it. Oh, I can't remember. It might have even been Monkhouse, you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe Cooper. I'm not sure. I think it's been passed down quite a lot. That
Yes.
one.
So, Joe, all
Yeah.
right, let's start the focus points and let's tunnel through them. So, Joe, what sort of comedy do you like?
What sort of comedy do I like? Well, it's pretty broad. It's pretty broad. I mean, my sort of first introduction to sort of what I would consider things that I like to watch. It's probably things like the old school comics, Tommy Cooper, but Laurel and Hardy and like Norman Wisdom and things like that. I think are always funny. I think they've got like especially Laurel and Hardy. I think they've got a sort of timeless quality to them. And I also think that because a lot of it is slapstick humor and visual humor, I think it's sort of it covers a lot of countries and a lot of cultures,
Yes.
because you can go to Greece, you can go to France, you can go to Spain, even I think there's a fan club in China of Laurel and Hardy. I think they're so universal, and I think it's the fact that they're understandable as well.
Yeah.
Um, their characters are understandable and they're likable because we relate to them. They're not bad people, if you know what I mean. Bad things happen to them.
Yes. That's a really
You
good
know.
point. I mean, it reminds me of I don't know if you ever saw one of Michael Palin, obviously of the Monty Python. He did a travel
Yeah.
one in one of his travel documentaries. He got privileged access into North Korea. And when he was in North Korea, he showed this North Korean lady the Monty Python sketch where they do the fish slapping routine.
Oh
and
yeah, yeah,
she absolutely loved it, and she was howling, and it's just that brilliant thing that of anything that they could have shown, because obviously the Monty Python also rely very heavily on words and the playfulness of language, but they also have fantastic little bits of physical comedy right there. And as you say, to
yeah,
kind of a
definitely.
Laurel and Hardy, it's funny in any language. Everyone
Yeah,
understands that it's funny when a man gets smacked into the water by a giant fish. Like, it just.
yeah. And I think there's an interesting way that comedy sort of came about. It's sort of one of those things that nobody really knows where it came from, you know. And I think one of the ways that it could come about is things like that, you know, watching people fall over. It's somehow funny, you know. Something about it just makes you laugh. And I think that human beings one of I think only one of a few species that actually um, can laugh or show some sort of enjoyment
Yes.
in something being funny. I think that some chimps can do it. You know, they can clap and express sort of happiness at funny things,
Such as
or
yourself.
amusing things. Yeah, and but yeah, no one really knows where it came from. But I think as well that the idea of seeing somebody in pain, which is what slapstick comedy is. Let's not forget,
Mm.
it's watching somebody in pain. But the idea of it being funny, I think, comes from the fact that we realise that that person is probably going to be okay. You know, like they fall over, they've hurt themselves, and it's relatable because everyone's fallen over and hurt themselves. You know, everyone knows what it feels like to get flipped in the nose or
Yes.
walk into a door. You know,
Stub your little toe.
yeah, I think slapstick comedy most of the time it's sort of like non-lethal. There are cases in which people have done like horror films and made them like really gory like slapsticks, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And I think that's quite interesting as well. But the only way that that works is if it's not realistic. You know, it's got to be somewhat absurd
Yeah, like
for that to work.
yeah, a heightened sense of everything just a little bit absurd, a little bit bouffon, a little bit
Yeah,
but
yeah,
all very
I
over the
think so.
top. The
Yeah,
oddly enough, because I'm going to use this opportunity to just promote a comedy that I absolutely adore, that I don't
yeah,
think gets anywhere near enough attention, partly because it's an absolute oldie, but also even amongst its time. And it's from 1955, so
yeah,
it came out just after I was born, and it was a film with Sir Alec Guinness, and it's called The Lady Killers. It's had
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah,
had many adaptations, theatre adaptations. I think the Coen brothers even tried to make a remake of it in the early 2000s. But what I was going to say
yeah.
was
I think
just, well, sorry, 1 minute, Joe. I was just going to say that conversely, I it's in that the comedy exists in how understated it is.
yeah,
It's in the subtlety. It's in the fact that they're trying to persuade basically a bunch of bank robbers move into this house with this little old lady, and they're trying to use her house as a base of operations so they can rob a bank. And it's just full of these really funny little things, like how they'll wash her dishes for her as they're persuading her why they should keep the money, and all these sorts of things. And it's full of so much charm, and it's just wonderful. And you don't really see that type of comedy anymore.
yeah. I was just about to say. I think I saw a production of it. Probably. Oh, it's got to be about 3 years ago, maybe three
Mm.
years ago. It was like a stage adaptation of it, but I think it's one of it is a classic. You know, it's a little bit like the 39 Steps.
Mm.
You know, it's something that's had a lot of um, a load of different adaptations of it. You know, and obviously because of the nature of it, it can be done with quite a small. It's a fairly small cast, so it's good both in theatre, and I think they did a film version of it. There's been many film versions of it, but there was one fairly recently. I think it must have been about, I don't know, maybe, yeah, about the same amount of time, probably about 6 years ago, I think, maybe. But it had some big names in it. But like you said, there's lots of different ways that you can sort of like underplay the comedy, and it makes it funnier as well. Like there's subtlety as well, which is I think that's one thing that you get in comedy that you don't necessarily get in other art forms, like other genres of theatre and things like that. Comedy has such a broad range, if you know what I mean. Whereas if you've got like a serious drama, yes, there's lots of different stories that you can tell, but the sort of idea of them has got to be somewhat consistent. Whereas comedy, I think, by its nature, I think breaks a lot of rules of the theatre itself. You can break the fourth wall, and I think it comes a lot, especially in England, from the tradition of pantomime and things like that. Music hall comedy and things like that, in which the comedian or the story that was being told directly to the audience, and there was never a sort of attempt to hide what it was. We're talking to you, and you're in on the joke. I think it was probably the main sort of thing that English people do, possibly different from the rest of the world, because English humour is very different to, say, American humour, French humour, and things like that.
Yes. I mean, I certainly agree with you on the American humour. I can't speak for many other senses of humour, but it's like, for anyone who hasn't seen, there was a marvellous interview with Stephen Fry that I'm sure Joe will know what I'm talking about, where Stephen Fry laid out the differences between American humour and British humour. And he was saying that the American humour is someone like Seinfeld, where the main character is full of quick comebacks and he's the smartest guy in the room, and he's, witty one-liners and all those sorts of things. Whereas in the British vein of comedy, we love the failure, we love the Basil Fawltys, we love the Captain Mannerings, we love the people who try desperately but just fail. We love the failure. We love, and I think that comes from the sort of self-deprecating humour that we have, that we've always had,
definitely.
really.
I think it comes from it. I actually think it comes from a position of politeness. Now, hear me out on this, because I don't know whether, because I've seen the Stephen Fry interview, and I don't know whether he maybe comes to a similar conclusion. But English people think that we're really, really polite. They think that we have really good manners. That's not necessarily the case. But what is the case is we try to at least show some kind of decorum. Even if I'm trying to think. For example, take Hyacinth Bouquet, right?
Oh, amazing character.
Hyacinth Bouquet, yeah. The what's he got? Onslow in it.
Yes.
I think there's a brilliant scene in which he spills some of his tea onto his little cup and saucer, and he slurps it from the saucer or something like that, and his wife says, "Oh, you're an animal. Come on, we're better than this. We've got decorum." And then she lets out a big burp or something like that. But it's the idea of them, at least trying to be civilized. Take for example Basil Fawlty. He runs an absolute hellhole of a hotel, but he's still trying to make it seem like it's good.
A place of standards, a place of civilization, a place where...
Definitely. And I think you have raised an interesting point there, because I don't know really why the American humor is different, but I think one of the only cases of sort of a comedian being the butt of the joke that worked in America was The American Office.
Which I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to discuss much because I haven't seen it, but I've heard.
I haven't seen a lot of it. I've maybe only seen a couple of episodes, like the first couple of ones that tended to stick pretty similarly to the English sort of the format that was already established by Ricky Gervais. And I think one of the real interesting ways in which it works, and I think it's a a real compliment to Ricky Gervais's writing skills, is the fact it's the scenario that works as well. And I think that the scenario is translatable because there's office workers everywhere.
Well, not only that, the show came about at the perfect time. For to have the social commentary on society that it was having.
Definitely.
It's The Office. Everyone knows about The Office. Everyone, has worked in an office, seen people working in offices, gone for a meeting at the office. It's such an easy concept for modern day people to grapple with.
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting about it is because this came out before the rise of sort of social media and things like that. There's scenes in it where he signs up to a dating website and things like that. And there's comedy there's comedy in that, because I think it was the internet was around, but it was still in sort of early stages in which it was almost like, say you've got a kid who's good at drawing. The internet was sort of maybe their sort of, they can draw arms and legs, and they can draw sort of their arms and legs, and they can at least put some detail in it, but it hasn't got the sort of nuance. Like, there wasn't any Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no Tinder, there was no Hinge, there was no anything like that. Wasn't even a concept at that moment in time. They probably had, like, I remember the old MSN Messenger and things like that. And that was the sort of only way of sort of messaging people, which was pretty much texting. It was sort of an extension of texting. So basically, I think that the way that comedy has evolved has also worked with the internet as well. I don't think that some of the subtleties in The Office would necessarily work now.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I can't really come back at an awful lot of that in terms of specifically talking about The Office, because I haven't seen either version. But what I can certainly, respond to you on is what you were saying there about the evolution of comedy through the internet. I mean, let's take a moment to just talk about the fact that we live in the golden age of memes, and how the internet has revolutionized memes, but not just memes for the sake of just making people laugh, but memes for the sake of things like other ways that comedy is always being used as a vehicle. Memes as a means of political pressure, as a mean of social change, as a means of hurting people's reputations, satire, all these sorts of things. Memes have branched out, really. I'd say, to sort of being the most widely used, because I've got one on my phone. I've got like a little meme maker on my phone where anyone can make a meme. Anyone can,
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Anyone can make a meme. And I think it's almost the same principle as a knock joke. There's a template that's followed, or a doctor joke. There's something about a meme, a template of a meme, that is always consistent. Okay, so you've got some form of picture that is normally the character in question. You know, there's normally a familiar, relatable character in question, and then the text is changed. So almost like in a knock-knock joke, you know the structure of it. You know that character, as it were.
Yes.
You know, whether it's the sort of you know whether it's the hello there meme, you know, from Star Wars, or you know something completely obscure like the troll in face, or the Wonka, the condescending Wonka.
Oh, condescending Wonka's great, yeah.
Yeah, you know, oh, you have 3 kids at 32 and live on your own. You must be looking for a strong, independent man who can give you everything. You know, it sort of works on the idea of characters, or the face, the facial expression of that character to make the joke.
It's not about the fact that it's Willy Wonka. It's about the fact that he just, in that capture, that moment, he looks like a guy being really condescending. So it's the archetype. It's just, the meme represents the archetype of someone looking down haughtily at other people.
I think what's really interesting is that, you know, they say a picture can tell 1,000 words. So I think that's really interesting, because facial expressions, you know, human beings are programmed to, you know, recognize facial cues from a real early age. You know, it's one of the things that we're actually born with, is the ability to recognize facial structures and things like that. And I think that the reason why anyone can almost make a meme is if you get the facial expression right, it gives you such it almost explains how you're feeling. You know, you can use that face to better explain how you feel about the words that you're writing, which I think is really interesting. It's almost like an emoji also. It sort of adds an emphasis of how you're feeling onto the joke itself, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose that's a good point. But then obviously, I mean, there's another thing, isn't there, with the way that the internet has changed. Well, not just comedy, but I mean, let's the amount of people that, as you say yourself at the start of the podcast, over the lockdown, you have created personally a bunch of comedy, little comedy sketches and little comedy snippets. It's like, you know, the internet has allowed just normal people, wherever they're from, to have that. I mean, you know, I mean, obviously back in the day, who was it? Was it Andy Warhol who said about, you know, everyone in the future will have their 15 seconds of fame, but the
I think it might have been him.
Yeah, but obviously the point being that it allows you to have the platform or the opportunity to be worthy of people's time that you might not have had otherwise. To show them what you can do.
I think that is true. That is true.
To show them what you're capable of.
Up the world of theatre and performing a lot more, I think.
Yes. I mean, particularly obviously because I don't like to go into specifics about me personally on the podcast and you, but just for the sake of example, like Joe and I, and a lot of the guests that I've previously had on my show, obviously we were at drama school when the first pandemic hit, and then we had to completely rethink how we performed, and all of a sudden, like most people in the world, it became not a performance in a theatre, but a performance over Zoom. And how does the artist, how does the creative mind overcome those things and still manage to get the reactions that they want? And that's been a very interesting process.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting with comedy, because, you know, stand-up comedy relies really, really heavily on the fact that there are people in that room listening to you tell your story or your joke
in real time.
You know, in real time, and it's all about, you know, a lot of comedians will tell you that it's not so much the joke. It's about the way that you tell it to those particular people, and it's something that you can never judge through a screen. There's been times when I've been performing on stage where I'll say one joke to test the water a little bit, and then depending on that reaction from the crowd, I'll either do the next bit or I'll move on to something else. So there's that trial and error, and that sort of that thing that you can only get with live performance. But what you get with YouTube comedy and what you get with online comedy is something really completely different. You get the like system, you see. So it's a case of they watched the whole video and they liked it or they didn't like it. It's a yes or no button now. And I think what's really interesting about the fact, because a lot of comedy has moved on to YouTube now, but I tell you how it's sort of happened. It now comes in the form of sort of live streams and things like that, which is not the same as stand-up comedy. The idea behind stand-up comedy is the comedian is almost like a philosopher. He's sharing his ideas and his his observations about the world that he lives in, really, and the nuances and the funny things that happen in usually everyday life. But now what you get is people who are playing video games online, and they're really, really talented at playing these games. They're really of a high level playing these games, some of them, and I think the comedy comes from them knowing their game really, really well, and them knowing funny things that they can do within the structure of the game, which I think is really quite interesting. And these people are likable, like PewDiePie or whatever he's called.
He's great. Yeah, he's great.
Or I'm trying to KSI is another one. They're likable people, aren't they? And I think that's one thing that comedians have in common, as comedy 101 is they're likable. Even Ricky Gervais and like Alan Carr and Frankie Boyle, who take the mickey out of the audience, they're still likable. They're the sort of person that you would see in the pub, and they would they would rip on people, but they do it in a good way.
Well,
it's all in jest.
Totally in jest. I mean, it's that thing, isn't it, that if you went to a Jimmy Carr gig and didn't expect to have him japing at you and ripping you, like you've gone to see the wrong guy. That's the specialty. You're there for you to be the joke as much as anything that comes out of his mouth. And we kind of I mean that can we just talk about that for a second, because that's something that's also quite, I mean, they have that thing, don't they, where they have like comedy roasts and everything, and people will go on just to have a joke at their own expense. And I think that's, I always deeply admire people who are able to do that. I'm just going to shill another film now, just off of that thought. There's this amazing film that I sat down with my dad once and watched. Fantastic film called Cannonball Run with Burt Reynolds.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely fantastic film. But the point I wanted to mention on it is that in it is Roger Moore. At the height of his fame, just off the back of doing his Bond films and everything, and in it, the character that Roger Moore plays is just Roger Moore, and it's just him taking the mick out of himself, just being this overly English gentleman, and he's driving a sports car, and every single time the camera cuts to him, he's got like a different woman in the car, and he's just he's boring them out of his minds. Out of their minds as he just talks about himself, and it's fantastic. It's just so, I love it when people have the guts to do that.
Well, I tell you what's really interesting about that, because it's definitely one of the earlier ones of that happening. It's one of the earlier, and it sort of leads me on to I watched a video on YouTube, and it was talking about spoof movies. You know, movies that are a parody of a thing. You know, and do you know the first film that's considered a spoof film was this guy. He made a film called The Great Train Robbery, and it was sort of an old silent movie, black and white, great train robbery movie. And the same guy made a movie called The Not So Great Train Robbery, or The Little Train Robbery, one of the two. And he built a railway in his back garden, like a miniature railway, and he got kids to do the film. So he parodied his own film just as a joke. And that's what's considered the very first spoof film. And then, of course, you've got things like Scary Movie, Aeroplane, all of those sort of like spoof movies, which actually aren't as popular now. They used to be really, really popular, but they've stopped. They've somehow stopped making as many of them, because I remember it was all the rage at one point. You had Meet the Spartans. You had all of these like really, really like low budget, but they weren't low budget. That's the thing. They were made to look low budget, but they probably had a really big budget. And there was all these spoof movies, but I don't think they make them as much anymore. And I'll tell you for why I think it is because they've already parodied superhero movies. They've already done that with the likes of sort of Kick-Ass and things like that. They're their own genre. They've sort of evolved into that. And I think there's so much craziness in the world that almost nowadays, just holding a mirror up is enough. It's almost a parody of itself. The whole world has almost become a little bit of a spoof. You've got sort of really big characters in politics like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson and all of these kind of people, and they are sort of like they're easily caricatured. And somebody said to me, a friend of mine who's really into puppets, he was talking about this Spitting Image.
Great.
The new series of Spitting Image, and one of the guys, I think he was actually involved in the sort of making of the puppets, and he was like, it was actually quite hard to do now, because they're such caricatured people in the public domain anyway, and people have memed it so much and things like that it's really hard to exaggerate these characters in a good way now.
Yeah, it's like, well, what?
It's almost quite hard to parody them.
Well, it's like, what could you, after millions and millions of people have done it, what could you bring to the table that's new that could possibly make these guys funny anymore? Actually, I'd like to, because I've got quite an interesting story about this, particularly with... that's a really good point about satirising politicians these days, because it's so easy. I'm not talking about left or right here. I'm just being general. I'm saying
general.
I'm saying politicians are really easy to mock, and because everyone has a platform and everyone has the right, which is fundamental. But there was a particular one back in the 60s when the great comedy actor Peter Cook was doing a stand-up or a performance at the I can't remember which particular one was, but it was some sort of comedy fringe. I think it might have been in London, but it was mocking the then Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. And Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister for 6 years, and on the whole, I think he seemed like, from the most I've read about him, he seemed like a really decent guy, even if he didn't get everything right.
Yeah.
But Peter Cook made this comedy sketch, satirizing his government and just calling it a disaster and all these sorts of things. The typical thing that you'd expect a comedy set to do and want it to do. But what I found to be so fantastic about this story was that Harold Macmillan bought a ticket and went to see it because he wanted to go and see what the public mood was, and he wanted to go and experience it, and he wanted to see what the audience reaction was. He wanted to get all these sorts of things, and Harold Macmillan was sat in the theatre watching this performance, and Peter Cook's on stage with his partner doing their sketch, and halfway through, Peter Cook clocks the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the audience, turns over to him, and just completely breaks a step and starts directly looking at him and joking at him and having jokes at his expense, and just like, and it goes beyond the sketch. It goes to fourth wall. It goes to I want you to get this. I want you to. And I
listen.
Yeah, and I felt really awful reading about this because Harold Macmillan fought in World War One and got wounded and stayed in a crater for 12 hours and all these sorts of things. And there's this fantastic little line in the play about Harold Macmillan called Never So Good, where Macmillan's character in the thing says, you know, I fought in that trench in World War One and on the in the war cabinet for World War Two, so that this college graduate comedian could have a joke at my expense. And I think that's just an absolutely fantastic story.
I think what's really interesting about that story is that the guy obviously he sort of had the balls to buy a ticket and go and watch it.
Yeah,
that's what's really interesting, and I think that we could all perhaps, you know, take something away from that story. You know, just because somebody is saying something about you, you know, it's probably a good idea to go and watch it. You know, it's probably a good idea to listen to it, and just hear it out. You know. And I think one of the really interesting things that you've got, especially nowadays, with this sort of I don't like to call it cancel culture because it doesn't really cancel anything. I don't like the terminology. What it is it doesn't cancel the person. The person is not is not cancelled from doing anything. What happens is people sort of come together in a sort of mob to almost do what that comedian was doing to obviously that Prime Minister guy. But instead of one person doing it, it's a lot of people just repeating the same thought. And there's a big difference between one person saying it and a lot of people just constantly bombarding people. And I think probably the best piece of political comedy I have seen for years and years and years and years was Ricky Gervais's speech at the Golden Globes, right?
Fantastic.
And the reason why it is so good is because he is saying what I would consider probably, you know, you're looking at about 90% of the general population think that way, and he was putting into a structured comedic speech what people think of ceremonies like that, like the Oscars, like the Golden Globes, these sort of like backslapping sort of circle jerk sessions where everybody sort of gets together and basically congratulates each other. Now, I don't see anything wrong with an award ceremony. You know, these people, you know, we're in the same industry. These people, you know, they clearly have worked hard to be where they are, most of them. And, you know, nobody's trying to sort of put a downer on any of their achievements, which he never did. Not once in his speech does he ever try and put a downer on anybody's achievements or their talent. He never once attacks their talent. What he does question is their moral character, is what he questions. He doesn't question their talent at all. He questions their moral character, and he also questions their hypocrisy. I think, it's that whole thing about, the Weinstein thing. He's like, well, you worked for him. You did it. Take at least have the decency to sit there and listen to what I'm saying to you now, because you did it. You did that yourselves. And I think what was really, really interesting about that speech and that Golden Globes award ceremony, it got ridiculous views.
Oh, hugely.
It improved the ratings by so much for that section that he did. All of his sections, and people continued to watch it for him. And what's really, really interesting is, I don't know if you've been reading about the Oscars and how the ratings were affected, but I think it was last year the viewership was sort of like, it was about 20-something million people tuned into the Oscars last year, which is still pretty good considering, the pandemic and everything. And, there weren't very many films coming out and things like that. But this year, the ratings were just under 10 million. That's a drop of about 60% viewership, right? And that's not a coincidence. That cannot be a coincidence. And people try and put it down to, there wasn't that many films out, and nobody really wanted to watch films, and people are losing interest because of the pandemic. I don't think that's the case, because YouTube are still getting millions and millions of views. Lots and lots of different award ceremonies, the music ones are still getting loads of reviews. People want entertainment more than ever, really. They're sat in their homes a lot of the time. They need something to occupy their free time. But what I think they don't want is, they don't want people telling them how to live and what to think. And I think that comedy now is sort of, it's in a really weird limbo land at the moment, because on one side of the field, you don't want to sort of rub people up the wrong way too much, but on the other side of things, you don't want to just play it easy and just do like what they did on, you ever seen that, the MASH report? And it's just
I mean, I was gutted that I did. I think I saw one funny sketch in the whole thing, but obviously it was a fairly popular show. I just want to come back to you a little bit on the whole Oscar thing, because I'm at a bit of a conundrum with this, because obviously the criticism that always gets levelled at the Hollywood celebrities is that, you're paid to act. We don't care about your political opinions, and that sort of thing. But the problem is, with that stance, the way that I see it, you can't just expect someone to stop caring about the things they care about because they reach a level of success and wealth. You can't expect them to suddenly not have causes and things that they wish to champion and and advocate for. But at the same, so I'm more sympathetic, oddly enough, with the A-list Hollywood celebrities than probably would be, because it's an unreasonable thing to demand of someone. Because if I were ever in that position where I garnered a certain amount of fame and wealth, and then all of a sudden I was told one day, actually, you're a little bit too influential for our liking now, and all the things that you ever cared about in your life, whether it be free speech or all these sorts of things, no, shut up. You're just we pay you to act. It's like that I think that'd feel like a very, very awful thing. What I think, however, is perhaps to the merit of people like Ricky Gervais on this, is that what I like about his style of comedy in this regard is that it serves the function to humble. It is to humble people who perhaps don't realize that they, for example, that these the arts has a long and I would argue noble and necessary history of talking truth to power, but also, but at the same time, the arts, certainly in Hollywood and all these sorts of things, are protected by these enormous corporations where, so they're talking truth to power whilst also simultaneously having an extraordinary amount of power. And they don't realize that, or certainly I can't say they don't realize, I say majoritively it feels like it comes across that they don't take account for the fact that they have an enormous amount of privilege in this position. I am never going to be able to, if someone says something at the awards ceremony that I take immense issue with, I'm never going to have the privilege of having that conversation with them because I'm beneath them. I'm not important. I'm just a speck in a population of billions. But they are able to have dialogues with individual people in positions of governmental power if they so wanted to pull the strings to do it. And so so to wrung your mouth off about these things, it feels, I'm not an over fan of, but it feels virtue signally. It feels like, well, you could actually do something. You could just have the dialogue. We don't need the show and pomp and ceremony of you going, look what a good person I am. You know, when you have that level of power.
I think what makes the sort of Oscars and the Golden Globes thing interesting is I think the reason why people take sort of such umbrage to those to those political speeches in that context is the fact that, like you say, it's an awards ceremony in which they are celebrating themselves. And then when they get the award, right, for being, best actor or whatever, and they come up and, the sort of the whole room is congratulating them for doing well, basically. And then they use that time to lecture other people on how to be better. I think it just adds a layer. It adds a layer that's not good. It's like you're already there being praised, okay? It's fine to be political. If you do that speech in another context, go do it on the news, in an interview, do it wherever. But when you're up there accepting an award, where, in a situation where everybody is sort of, and let's not forget that the Oscars as well, these are the 1% of actors, right? These are the creme de la creme. These are the richest of the rich. They're they're the sort of like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates of the acting. They're the pinnacle, They're the moneymaker. They're the Jeff Bezos of acting. They're the ones with the money. They're the ones with the influence. They're the ones with everything. And you just and you think to yourself, oh, okay, whatever your name is, Joaquin Phoenix, or brilliant portrayal as the Joker, fantastic actor, right? Don't go and tell Dan in his white van that he needs to get an electric car because he's the one that's causing the problem with the environment when you've got a private jet. So don't tell Steve the plumber that he needs to stop having his steak on a Friday, to save the world. These people are hard-working people. They've got no way of changing their world a lot of the time. They have not got the means to be shopping free range in Waitrose and getting eggs that come straight from the chicken's bowl. You know, they're nowhere near a farm. They live in the middle of South London or wherever they are. You know, they've got a shop in Iceland. They've got to buy cheap imported lager from Lidl. You know, they're barely making ends meet as it is. They are not worried about the things that you're worried about. And the thing that's really interesting about it is that because they've got so much money and because they don't have to do work anymore. They have to do their films, and yes, they probably work really, really hard when they're doing those films, but I imagine they have a lot of downtime. And I think that the thing that they get wrong is when they try and preach to people, they don't humble themselves before it. And that's why these award ceremonies like the Oscars gets rid of any chance of them humbling themselves before they make that speech, because it's like, you've just won a solid gold award that would feed my family for a month, probably more.
I'm not sure. Are they still?
But
are they made
now,
of gold?
Are they still solid? I don't know.
I don't know.
I've never. I don't know what they're made of.
No,
I imagine they, because if that's solid, it might be like a metal inside and then maybe gold plated. But they've definitely got to be gold.
Well, I'm just saying, if the award is chocolate, then it wouldn't feed you for a month. It'd feed you for about 2 days.
It's like a Kinder egg inside.
Yeah, exactly.
They get home and unwrap it. You know.
No,
it's like one of those little Easter bunnies you get.
Absolutely, they're lovely. No, I was just going to say though, but let's try, because we've gone off on a bit of a tangent here. To bring it to bring it back to the comedy. So it's just
definitely.
I suppose the point that we're kind of getting to is just that it's important and necessary for everyone to be able to have a joke at their expense. Can we just
definitely
let's just end it then with by talking about your thoughts on this, because we've got about 10 minutes left. So what's your thought on the philosophy of that comedy should only be used to punch up and not to punch down?
I disagree.
Okay.
Because and let me tell you why I disagree. Is because you can be from a place where, you know, it would be, say for example, take like a really, I'm trying to think of a working class comedian. Take Tommy Cooper for example, right? Comes from Devon sort of way, I think, so that sort of area, I believe. And then he moved up to London, I believe. And he came from a pretty humble background, you know, pretty standard for the time. But he did at times punch down. You know, he would take the mickey out of, you know, his wife, who probably at the time, you know, given, you know, societal roles and stuff, it would be sort of a bit punching down to take the mick out of your wife, your housewife, or your secretary, or, you know, shop workers and things like that. But I don't think, I think it's okay to punch down so long as you can be punched down at too. If you know what I mean. If you're somebody, say Ricky Gervais, he can punch down because he's also not the top. People could easily take the mick out of him, and they have done, for him being, you know, a little bit overweight, or, you know, British, or, you know, he also takes the mick out of himself. Yes. I think. So I think if you're, I don't think it's necessarily a case of punching up or down. I think it's a case of you should be able to punch it at everyone.
Well, I agree, because the problem is that otherwise you basically have protected classes and protected characteristics and all these sorts of things. And the moment you cordon off one of those things, someone else can simply demand, well, I feel I need that protection too. So who do you?
Yeah.
It's almost like the free speech thing. It's like, who do you trust to tell you where the line is drawn?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And I think it also would make it more awkward, right? Say if you're doing a comedy, a stand-up show, and you've seen my stand-up show. My stand-up show hasn't got anything in it. It's family. It's a family show.
From what I remember, yes.
It's got prop gags, and I don't say anything political in my set at all. I don't feel it's relevant to what I do or my style of comedy at the moment. I have done in the past, but I don't really do it as much anymore. But I think if you're a comedian and you are one of those comedians that do take the mickey out of the audience, you can't go say you've got the front row all lined up. You've got a chubby woman there. You have a little go at her. You've got a bald guy there who's next to her. You take the mick out of him, and then you've got a skinny guy with glasses, and you take the mick out of him a little bit as well. And then you get to the woman in the wheelchair, and you go, oh no, I'll skip you. Sorry, move on to the next one. It makes it more awkward for them. And it would make them feel more like if I say for example, I was, in some sort of, minority, and the comedian is sort of, having a general pop at sort of everything, and then it gets to me and they go, oh no, sorry, I won't talk about you. I would want them to say, no, why am I not worthy of the same joke,
Well, you're giving different treatment to people. Which is what we're kind of aspiring not to do. We want to treat people equally, which means we want to. But I'd just like to come on to that point because I think this is kind of one of the reasons why we have such a good comedy tradition in this country is that we're a union of 4 countries. We're a union of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, and what I like about this is that we have this banter with each other. The English are the posh ones, the Scottish are all fat and ginger, the Welsh get a bit too intimate with the sheep, and the Irish are all and the Irish are always drunk. Those are the stereotypes. Those are the jokes about every single nation. But what I like about that is, certainly in my mind, it's never serious. It's just teasing. It's a way of normalizing banter, and banter is an amazing tool, I find, for breaking down barriers and making people more amiable to one another.
I think it puts people on a level playing field. And it does.
I think it puts them at ease, majoritively, from my experience as well. It's like,
a lot of the time,
this guy can just have a joke. We're just going to have a joke, That's always been my experience, at least.
And I think it's going back to the point that you said. There's almost a sort of I think being able to laugh at yourself is a really, really big skill, and I think it should be taught a lot more.
Absolutely.
It should be taught a lot more, and I think it's maybe a generational thing also. It's maybe a generational thing, but I think you've got a generation, particularly now, and I this is a little bit contrary to popular belief. I actually don't think it's teenagers that are doing this thing of you can't say anything, because I've got younger brothers. I've got brothers that are 5 years younger than me, and they say far worse jokes than I said at that particular age. I think it's the middle ground. It's basically our age group. The age group above us, the sort of the ones that are about, I would say 30 odd now, they're the ones who can't take the joke for some reason, for whatever reason, and I don't know why. I don't know why, but they're not as good at laughing at themselves and their own stereotypes.
I don't know if I agree. I think that your I mean, you make a good point, but at the end of the day, the analogy you use of your brothers could just simply be down to the environment that they've been brought up in with you. They're just the next generation of you yourself, as opposed to
Yeah, but I don't think that that's the case, because if you look at like the way that memes are going and the way that all of these things are happening, they're more edgy. There's sort of an almost rebellious nature to them, you know. They're sort of the generation now that are sort of like, yes, we do know how to use the internet, and we will do what we want with it.
well,
And I think that gives it a certain edge that I think is quite interesting.
well, every generation has to be at least a little bit rebellious. For if it wasn't, every generation would simply be the same as the last. But
Yeah, definitely. But I think, but that's my point. I think the people that are sort of like 30-year-olds now didn't really have that much to rebel against, so they found something that wasn't really a problem, and they went after faulty towers. They went after Only Fools and Horses. They went after those classic sort of British institution comedies. They went after them because they represented the old working geezers at the pub that they wanted to rebel against. And I think that they've gone after that in a way that's sort of like, yeah, you're old now, and what you did we don't like. No.
well, I mean, I can certainly agree with you that there is obviously been certain in this age. It's becoming more apparent there's a clash of standards and what is acceptable to laugh at and what isn't. But I'd struggle to. I'd have to look into my own evidence for how to define that by age.
Yeah, I don't know whether anyone's actually ever done a study on it, but I think it would be really interesting to sort of look at the age group of people. I tell you what would be really interesting is just to look at maybe the complaints department at the BBC and see what the age group was, what the demographic for the complaints was, because I think it might surprise you. It might surprise you.
I'm not very sure. I'm not sure if it's possible to figure out the demographic of that. I mean, would you have to put your age when you're making a complaint?
I don't know. I think they would maybe have to do it on TV license, because I'm fairly sure that you have to have your name and address for a TV license. So they could probably look up who you are.
Well,
100%.
all right. Well, I'm just going to have to take your word for that, because I don't have the information on me to challenge it.
Have you not? They're still peddling the idea that they've got TV detector vans, and they can detect whether you're watching BBC TV or whatever.
I haven't heard anything of the sort, and I'm going to ask you to remove the tinfoil hat now. And also, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry if anyone's listening who is exactly 30 years old and has felt really personal.
No, this was from the BBC. They had full on TV adverts and everything. You can look it up. The BBC themselves put out TV advertisements that showed these vans that had like they were like prop antennas on the top of them. You can't make it up. And they had adverts on the television that said, we as the BBC can park outside in the street and we can detect whether you're watching BBC TV live and what channel you're watching and in what room of the house you're watching it as well.
Well,
and the BBC had taxpayer adverts, right? This was funded by your tax.
Send me the link.
TV,
find me the link.
Spending people's money on adverts literally for that, and it was proven to be a complete lie. They did like a whole panorama documentary on it, and I think somebody came out from like NASA and was like, yeah, this technology definitely doesn't exist, and if it did, BBC would be the last people to have it.
It's just
There's
scare
no way
tactics.
that they could possibly do that.
No.
And the BBC still kept it going for, and they still do it now. You will still get a letter through your door saying, we suspect that you might be watching BBC. We think you're watching Antiques Roadshow, and you need to pay for it. You know, I just think it's really interesting. The BBC, just in general, as a corporation, is just it's just crazy now. Like, if you tried to make Monty Python now, the BBC would never greenlight it.
Well, no,
it would never be greenlit.
Well, they did say that. I remember. Now, that I can agree with you on, because I've seen the article about it. But post me the link for the
TV detective vans.
Post me the link, and I will link it in the video.
It's really, really interesting. Really, really interesting.
Okay.
I think that's comedy in itself. If that was made as a comedy sketch, it was the greatest double bluff in the history of mankind. If that was a joke for people within the BBC to laugh at themselves, that would have been the best joke in the world. The best joke in the world, you know. Oh. I still think it might be. I think they were having a laugh and seeing what they could get away with.
Yeah, a bit of 4D chess. Right, okay. Well, off that very heightened bunch of moments, we'll call it an end there. So I don't know if I'm allowed.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if I'm allowed to, if this is copyright or anything, but I'll just say, and on that bombshell, it's time to end. So, Joe, thank you for joining me today to discuss comedy, and
thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and what petered into a few other topics along the way, but I think we just sort of, it's all relevant to the grander scheme of things, isn't it? I mean.
Just in general, and I think to talk about one thing, you've sort of got to include, you know, other stuff. You know, you've got to include the context of it, because else it just becomes a case of simply just talking about what comedians we like, really, without any context.
Yeah, absolutely. Scope. That's what you get on this podcast, ladies and gentlemen. Scope.
That's the one.
So,
Scope.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and join me next time for the next Amiable Argument.